Did you ever consider divorcing me, as people online seem to think?
No.
At BYU, essentially, as soon as you've committed to dating someone seriously, you have more or less set yourself on the track to getting married.
After you'd shared with her that we had met playing Dungeons and Dragons, that she asked if I'd be willing to give that up if we got married in order to be a good husband and father.
So when you're trying to keep this peck on the lips only rule, it's really hard to follow the rules.
Kiss like Jesus is watching.
Yes, exactly. So welcome to today's video. This is my husband, Jackson. He's jumping in today because I get so many questions about how my relationship survived leaving the ultra-strict Mormon Church, how we worked it out together. So many people have asked if he divorced me.
Nope, still here.
Still here. So we're going to tell our whole relationship story, our very Mormon dating experiences going to BYU, our wedding, what that was like getting married in the Mormon temple, and what it was like for me to break the news that I no longer believed that I wanted to be Mormon and the church was not true.
Big news. All this and more on today's episode.
I'm so excited to introduce the sponsor of this video, Surfshark. You may know I've made a lot of videos about the Mormon temple, and every time I post something like this, I inevitably get a lot of negative, hateful comments, which is why it's become very important to me to keep my personal data secure. Surfshark VPN is a virtual private network that keeps my online identity safe by encrypting the information between my computer and the internet. This keeps my personal data protected from big companies and from cyber criminals. As you all know, since I left the church, I've also become quite addicted to coffee, and so I spend a lot of time working in coffee shops. However, using public Wi-Fi is a little bit risky, and the great thing about using a VPN is that it protects my personal data when I use free public Wi-Fi. This amazing tool also allows you to unblock content libraries and streaming services from other countries, like all the Netflix libraries. Surfshark also allows you to bypass censorship everywhere. It helps you unblock blocked content in other countries and bypasses geo restrictions. Surfshark VPN is incredibly versatile and has so many benefits, which is why I'm very excited for this sponsorship. Enter coupon code Alyssa for an additional 4 months free at surfshark.deals/Alyssa. You can also use the QR code here, and the link will be in the description below. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so trying it is risk-free. So what do you remember about when we first met?
At the time, I had a roommate who told me that he had a sister-in-law who just got home from her mission, and he did not approve of her boyfriend. And so he let me know that, maybe I should consider trying to take her out on a date.
Yeah, well, before I was dating you, I was dating the most square Mormon boy imaginable, and my sister was bummed that I was dating such a dud.
Which, if you're watching this, sorry, bud, you were just off your mission. It happens that way.
I'd like to think that he probably thinks he dodged a bullet at this point with this whole social media.
With this whole thing, yeah. Anyway, so my roommate invited his sister-in-law to get breakfast with him, and they were supposed to meet at our apartment before they went out for breakfast. And so in walks the sister-in-law, this fine specimen here. I was ill-prepared to meet such a beauty. I was in my PJs, looking very disheveled, chilling on the couch. But from that moment, I knew I was going to have to make a move.
Didn't you say that you got like wifey vibes? Like you were like, I gotta put a ring.
Gotta wife that. Yeah. It was the spirit moving upon me, inspiring me.
Which I'll say to your credit, you never pulled that line. I did have other guys pull the line that the Lord inspired them to marry me or date me or something.
I don't think I was holy enough for you to believe that. I had actually been invited along to breakfast, but I was in no shape to go to breakfast. So I think that the first time we got to really talk was at a like Dungeons and Dragons game a few weeks later.
Yeah, so that was Jackson's side of the story. When I was going to breakfast, and I don't think I even really heard anything about you. My sister was not putting the same little, she was not telling me that I should be dating you. Mostly she was telling me I should not be dating this one guy.
Come on, sis.
She was kind of laying the suitors out for me kind of pitching different guys maybe that might work out. But so when I first went to their apartment to go get breakfast with my brother-in-law, Jackson was there, and he had recently gotten knee surgery.
Yeah, I just dislocated my knee, and it was pretty gnarly.
He was on some pain medication at the time. And so when I walked in, and to give a little more context, my brother-in-law had another friend who he was kind of looking out for, taking care of. He had a friend who was down on his luck, and my brother-in-law very kindly was helping him out. And so when I walked in and saw Jackson, he was kind of slurring his speech, and he...
As bad as that, huh? Slurring.
He was giving me down on his luck vibes. And I thought to myself, oh, this is so nice. My brother-in-law has another friend that he's looking out for. And Jackson also has a scar in the back of his head. Which, do you want to show them your scar?
Sure, yeah, gnarly.
So when I first walked in, I saw this scar, and I thought maybe he, had a brain injury, and that my brother-in-law had taken, out of the kindness of his heart, had taken pity on this poor man. And when we had our conversation, our 5-minute first time meeting back and forth, I just was wanting to give him a little pat on the head, give him a little, you got this, buddy.
Who's to say I'm not a project? I may still be.
That's fair. But yes, as time went on, obviously, I did come to realize that you're a fully functioning adult.
Mostly.
A few weeks went by. We had our first conversation playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Which, for those of you who know, it's the Satan's game.
Yes, it was it was a little taboo that we were playing Dungeons and Dragons. The mania around Satanic Panic, I think, has worn off, so I don't think most people at BYU even knew what Dungeons and Dragons was at that point. Maybe, I don't know, but I didn't know what it was before we started playing it. So you asked me out on, I think, our second or third round of playing D&D. And what do you remember about our courtship?
Our courtship.
Our very Mormon courtship.
Well, one of my favorite memories, just to illustrate a little bit about dating at BYU, and also what an absolute trophy of a woman I wound up with here. So after we'd gone on a couple of dates, Alyssa invited me to a party at her apartment. And so I show up fashionably late, like 2 minutes after the time you'd invited me over, and I was the first one to arrive. So we were visiting, having a little conversation, chilling on the couch. After a little bit, the doorbell rings, and a guy comes in. And a couple minutes later, doorbell rings again, another dude. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, probably 8-10 guys show up, and they all clearly have it bad for Alyssa. This is a party of just dudes who are interested in dating Alyssa.
And this story makes me sound horrible, and I have always this story, or this party was so embarrassing because I had very carefully invited the same number of men and women so that there'd be, a balance, and so that everybody had somebody to talk to, and so there, it was just, I had invited and confirmed that similar amounts of men and women were going to be coming to this party. But then, night of, all of my female friends texting me, oh, I can't make it tonight. Sorry, I have to study. And almost all of my female friends dropped at the last minute.
But this hot commodity did not have any dudes backing out. So, I'm doing a good job kind of, working the room, controlling the prime real estate next to Alyssa. But I had a trip I was supposed to be going on with brother-in-law, same guy, my roommate. We were supposed to be leaving on a trip that evening. And so I had to leave to go and meet with him. And as I'm leaving the apartment, I see the tallest, handsomest specimen of a dude in the room move to fill the vacant spot I left behind next to Alyssa. And it wounded my heart. So I take off to go start this trip, but unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, the trip had to be canceled at the last minute. And so I'd only left about 20 minutes earlier, and I thought, I have to go back. I have to go reclaim that spot.
Can't let me get swooped away.
Can't let Alyssa get swept off her feet. But I needed a distraction, something to mix up the seating in the room, something to give me the opportunity to kind of squeeze back into the prime spot next to Alyssa. So I did what any self-respecting college man would do. I went to Little Caesars and I bought like 6 pizzas and like a bunch of bags of crazy bread. And I come back over, I knock on the door, I say, "Hey guys, I brought pizza." And all these starving college students get up to go and swarm the pizza. And
I remember being so impressed because I was so poor in college, and I remember being impressed that you could afford to buy that many Little Caesars pizzas. It's like, this guy.
A provider.
This is provider. Wealth. This is the true wealth. This is who I need to marry because he's the wealthiest man I've met at BYU.
And so, Alyssa comes up to say, "Wow, thank you so much for bringing pizza. That's so nice of you." And I knew I'd clinched it. So that night, that evening, was later described by one of the attendees who apparently also did comedy at BYU as the Alyssa Games. And I love that description of it. That is what it felt like. It definitely felt like a knockdown, drag out for Alyssa's heart.
Gosh. I feel like you always remember that story as the time you bagged your wife, and you impressed. It was very impressive. Don't get me wrong, but I was so embarrassed, and I was so bummed that it basically looked like I was the one that orchestrated the Alyssa Games so that I could be the center of attention, and I actually just wanted to curl up in a ball and die. So that's my side of that story. But I do feel like as we were dating at BYU, we had so many very Mormon dating experiences. Like I remember once when we were officially dating, you asked me, you needed to get something from your room. And at BYU, one of the rules is you can't cross the threshold of the opposite gender's bedroom. You only can stay in the common areas. So I remember you needed to get something from your room, and you said, "Why don't you can come in and sit on the bed while I look for it." And I refused and was like, I don't know what kind of girl you think I am, but I will not be crossing the threshold to your bedroom. As we were dating too, I think we started to get to know each other, obviously, as you do, and we had some conversations that I felt like were very confusing for me because we obviously started falling in love, we were having great conversations, but then sometimes Jackson would just say things that would make my Mormon meter go off, that I should not be dating this person, which was very confusing because me as a human being, very much enjoying getting to know each other, falling in love, but me as a Mormon was feeling like maybe this relationship shouldn't work out. In some of these early conversations, I remember mentioning very casually and offhandedly, "Hey, I don't think gay people should be able to get married. They can go and be in relationships if you want, but I believe that marriage is only meant to be between a man and a woman," which is something that's very much echoed in all of the church. It's in the document, The Family, A Proclamation to the World. And so when I expressed that, I was definitely expressing the canon view of most Mormons is that gay people should not be able to get married.
And I remember when we were discussing this, asking why it is that your religious beliefs should dictate how anyone else has to live, that it's, really inappropriate to be using government in order to enforce a religious belief, ultimately.
Yeah, and I feel like when you said that, it felt like a slap on the face, just because I had never considered the impact of my religious beliefs on gay people. I felt very vindicated in having this totally bigoted point of view, just because I had never really reflected on the real life impact of my beliefs and how my religion was being used, and Christianity in general, to kind of control these people's ability to live in the way and love in the way that they wanted to. And so that conversation is a good example of many different conversations we had when we were dating that made me feel like Jackson had these points of view that didn't fall in line with the Mormon accepted norm, which I felt like I shouldn't like, but I also found so engaging and very interesting and so cool, was his ability to kind of see nuance in a lot of these religious ideals that I had been presented as completely black and white. Just a quick reminder to like this video if you've enjoyed it so far, subscribe to my channel. I release a new video every week about Mormonism, my experience, Mormon doctrine, that kind of a thing, and drop a comment below if you have any questions for Jackson or I. I'll be going through the comments and answering questions after the video gets posted.
So, like any good Provo couple, the pressure bore down upon us as we continued to date to get engaged. And in fact, the same brother-in-law and sister-in-law who introduced us were getting married and even asked us if we'd like to get engaged at their wedding. We ultimately decided not to, but certainly the pressure, the environmental pressure was on for us to get engaged.
My one specific memory I have is that we would go to church together, and I remember our bishop, or my bishop, because we weren't in the same ward yet, coming up to me at some point and saying, Jackson seems like a great guy. And we'd probably been only dating seriously for 2 or 3 months. And my bishop just in the hallway asked me when we were going to get engaged. And there's this unspoken rule at BYU that basically as soon as you pair off and you're official, you're setting yourself on the track to get married.
The clock is ticking.
Yeah. So not a lot of people date for a few months and then break up, date someone else for a few months, break up, date for a couple years, break up, date someone, that's normal people stuff. At BYU, essentially, as soon as you've committed to dating someone seriously, you have more or less set yourself on the track to getting married. So when the bishop asked, when are you guys going to get married? I didn't even bat an eye because I expected that the bishop would be wondering that because it was so normal. And that's a question that my friends were asked when they were dating seriously. And
that's a question that Alyssa asked me frequently. When are we getting engaged?
Did I really?
Yeah, more than once. You'd be like, when are you going to propose,
Yeah,
Jackson?
that's true.
When's the proposal
I think of the two of us, I was definitely way more in a rush than Jackson.
Don't get me wrong. I was excited.
I think that I had just seen so many friends, one of my friends got married at BYU. They got engaged within 2 weeks of meeting each other and married a month later. And so by comparison, I feel like we're in the slow lane over here, dating for 6 months before getting engaged. I mean, when everybody at BYU says, when you know, you know. So I would say to Jackson, well, when you know, you know. I mean, if we know we want to get married, we might as well get married tomorrow or yesterday if that would be more ideal.
And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that, I was in the culture, but not of the culture of Provo. I think you were
and
much more...
Mormonism in general.
And Mormonism in general. I think you were much, much more sort of intimately tied to kind of BYU's culture and also a much more traditional Mormon culture than I was.
Yeah, because your mom left the church when you were 2, 3?
Yeah, young.
Yeah.
Really, really early on, my parents split up and my mom was out of the church. So I was raised with one family that was very active LDS and one that wasn't at all.
Which when we were dating, my mom did question... I think it was prior to us getting engaged. So our relationship was getting more serious. I'm talking to my mom, me and this guy are getting more serious. I remember her saying basically that she was wondering if Jackson was going to be a good spouse because he was friends with my brother-in-law, who we've been mentioning, who had recently left the church. So she felt like because they were associating, that was a sign that the marriage was not, like, I shouldn't marry him and that I should go find someone who was against the anti-Mormons a little bit more, because him being friends with our brother-in-law was a sign that he wasn't righteous enough.
Which apparently was a valid concern.
But since I was the one that's triggered the leaving, I like to take credit for the leaving, personally.
You are the Eve in this relationship. It's true. The woman thou gavest to me.
Yes. So I think we both did it to each other. I'd like to think that it was a team effort for us to leave the church.
I mean, I think your mom had at least a few misgivings about me. I know that you told me at one point, after you'd shared with her that we had met playing Dungeons and Dragons, that she asked if I'd be willing to give that up if we got married in order to be a good husband and father.
Yeah.
We know that the number one cause of deadbeat dads out there is Dungeons and Dragons.
Don't play Dungeons and Dragons, or you can't also be a good father.
That's right.
She lived through the Satanic Panic, and she never got possessed. So I think she felt like keeping the church close was very important. But yeah, she did ask if Jackson would be willing to give up D&D in order to be a good husband and father. Another funny aspect of us dating, especially after we got engaged, once you're engaged, you are full speed ahead. You know you want to get married. You're planning on it. I think from engagement to marriage was 2 or 3 months. It was pretty quick. But then you, of course, want to spend a ton of time together. So this is like one of the things that caused me the most guilt leading up to our wedding, is that I would go over to Jackson's apartment and we'd watch a movie, we'd be hanging out. And this was also when I was working at the MTC, the Missionary Training Center, where you train missionaries how to do missionary work. And so I'm having this very spiritual job while also trying to follow all of the rules that are required at BYU. And it was a very confusing time. But as we were dating, I would go over to your apartment and we'd watch a movie and we would lay in bed next to each other and never did any funny business because we were two very good Mormon kids. But sometimes we would fall asleep in the same bed, and I would wake up at 2 or 3 a.m., get back in my car, or even just in the morning, get back in my car, and I would go from spending the night just sleeping in your bed, no funny business, and I would drive to the MTC and go teach the missionaries. And you get all of these crazy messages at the MTC. You'll have these meetings where people will say, hey, if you did anything last night that would keep you from feeling the Spirit, you need to report it to your boss and get out of the MTC because you will bring our missionaries down and keep us from finding converts to bring to the church. And they always give the most intense eye contact. And you also have to get interviewed before you can go to the temple to get married. So I remember there'd be some nights where I would spend the night, and they ask, if you've done anything during the temple recommend questions. They ask if you've done anything that would disqualify you from receiving a temple recommend. Basically, if you've kept the law of chastity and everything associated with the law of chastity. And I felt so bad. Did you feel guilty? I feel like I felt a lot more guilty because I was the more Mormon-y of the two of us.
I remember one time you said, I think I need to talk to my bishop about this. Do you feel like you need to talk to your bishop about it? And I said, no, I talked to the Lord. I think I'm good.
Yeah, Jackson would just be like, I prayed about it.
Me and God are cool.
Good.
Yeah, we're all right.
And I confessed to the bishop once when we were dating. I did once end up confessing a small rule breaking to the bishop, and oh gosh, it's just so hard because when you're dating as like adults, when you're two adults dating and you're supposed to keep this incredibly strict rule. I mean, the guideline is no open-mouthed kissing. So when you're trying to keep this peck on the lips only rule, it's really hard to follow the rules.
Kiss like Jesus is watching.
Yes, exactly. So I think on our wedding night, honestly, I was just relieved that all of this religious guilt could finally start to fall away because I had been feeling so guilty leading up to our wedding. And it's not even like we broke the law of chastity. I was just sleeping in your bed for too long. And even that was enough guilt to feel like it was going to crush me.
I was also relieved on our wedding night.
Oh my God. We did. Jackson proposed. I said yes. We got married. I think it was under a year from first meeting to wedding day. I want to say, I calculated it once. It was like 11 months, 10 or 11. So we got married in the temple, fully in our temple robes.
the newly opened Payson Temple, no less.
And I remember, I've shared some stories from that day, but I remember just feeling like the temple aspect of the entire ceremony or the entire day was awful. My grandma drove up from Albuquerque, my grandma and grandpa, and they sat in the parking lot. And my sister, who had already left, sat in the parking lot.
My mom and my brother and sister.
Most of his family, on his mom's side, had to sit in the parking lot. And, we had a ring ceremony after because a lot of Mormons do that or a civil ceremony now. But we had a ring ceremony to kind of throw the non-members a bone. And even during the ring ceremony, our bishop mentioned several times about how what happened in the temple earlier today was the true, most important aspect of the day. That was the most sacred part. That was the most important part. And, for anyone sitting in the audience, it does feel like a slap in the face to be told that we're having a ring ceremony for you, but during the ring ceremony, you're going to be continuously reminded about how unimportant the ring ceremony is compared to the real ceremony, which none of you were considered worthy enough to attend. And what do you remember about our wedding day?
Well, I remember you weren't allowed to wear your wedding dress because it wasn't as white as a sheet of printer paper.
I remember that.
I remember...
And they told me the day of, which was the worst part, because the girl in the shop that sold me the dress said it was white enough. And I had called the temple because I had some friends who went through this. And I called the temple and they wouldn't commit. They don't even let you bring in the dress ahead of time. They said it's up to the decision of whoever's running the temple that day, basically, to make the final call. So they wouldn't even tell me if I needed to go return the dress to get a different dress.
I also remember that the gentleman who did the sealing got your name wrong.
Yes. Alyssa, I mean, it's a pretty common name.
Alusa?
Yeah.
In general, I think one of the kind of difficult things about at least our temple wedding, and I don't know about yours, I don't know about anyone else's, but at least ours, is the extent to which it really has nothing to do with you. You are on a marriage assembly line that is heavily standardized and optimized for speed and efficiency. And that excludes
those are exactly the two words you want to hear on your wedding day. Speed and efficiency.
Speed and efficiency. And that excludes many of the most important people in your life. And so I loved our wedding day. It was great, and we had a lot of fun at the reception. But I do think that the temple marriage aspect of it left something to be desired.
Yeah, and I remember too, when you get married in a temple, you sit across from each other on an altar. You have your full robes of the holy priesthood on. But before you get to go into it's called the sealing room, you go into the bride's room, which is where you're supposed to get ready, finish your makeup, get changed, that kind of a thing. And I remember when I was in the bride's room, I want to say there were 3 to 4 other brides in the bride's room with their moms and their sisters. And it was really crowded. There was not, first of all, you can't even take pictures. I've been so jealous of so many women have the pictures of their mom zipping up the dress. I don't have a picture of that because there's no cameras allowed in the temple at all or even in that room. And so I don't have any pictures of that moment. But even if I did, there would be 3 or 4 other brides in my pictures with their mommies getting them into their dresses. Another bummer was they don't allow you to say vows. So we did get to say vows during our ring ceremony, but they're not real vows. Then you're just saying things. A ring ceremony is not the same as an actual wedding.
As I recall, you're actually explicitly discouraged from saying vows or making promises in the ring ceremony.
Yeah, the ring ceremony still has a whole set of rules according to the Mormon Church. So you can't even go off and kind of do your own thing. The bishop is supposed to officiate. There's kind of a script for him to follow. And so even for the ring ceremony, it still has its own code of rules. At least it did when we got married. I do think, though, I've had so many people comment that we need to renew our vows. And I think, maybe one of these days we'll go to Vegas.
Hey.
And we'll do a little vow renewal. I think we owe it to ourselves.
So I don't remember if it was shortly after we got engaged or shortly after we got married, but at some point we are discussing combining finances. And Alyssa asked a question that made my blood run cold. She asked, do you pay tithing on gross or net income? For those of you who don't know, the right answer is that you pay tithing on gross income. But tentatively, I said net.
Which, if you're not familiar with that, what that means, basically, do you pay tithing before taxes or after taxes? Because if you're paying before you pay your taxes, that is a huge percentage of your paycheck.
So I had barely gotten the word net out before Alyssa said, I think we're going to pay on gross.
And what I was sometimes told is, do you want gross blessings or net blessings? Because if you pay your full tithing prior to paying tax, you're showing the Lord how righteous you are and how hungry you are for those tithing blessings that the Lord has promised you. So I had always paid on my pre-tax salary or income, but Jackson, and when we first got married, I will say that there were, in the same way when we were dating, there were moments where we had these disagreements. Then after we were married, we kind of continued to have these little moments where I feel like Jackson would say something and I would feel kind of pushed towards thinking of things in a more critical way, a more thoughtful way. Like, for example, I remember sharing the opinion that in schools, it should be abstinence sex education only, because if you teach them anything to do with sex other than abstinence, they're going to learn how to have sex. And then you're just going to have all of these knocked up teenage girls, all of these unplanned pregnancies. So you have to teach abstinence only sex education in schools. And Jackson said,
I think they can figure out how to have sex all on their own. But why? It just seemed to me, and seems to me still, that a realistic view of this is to say, well, maybe we should teach them how to avoid pregnancy.
I think the underpinning argument I often had was that the religion was right and that any education or information outside of what I perceived to be religiously important was bad. And Jackson always advocated for the fact that information and sharing information, giving education, is a really positive thing in people's lives, and we shouldn't be afraid of information and education. And I think that's just one other example of, I wouldn't even call these arguments as much as Jackson would just drop a little truth bomb, and I would scuttle to try to figure out how to defend myself from my Mormon mindset, and found that often what I had been taught or led to believe about the way the world should work was really small and narrow and not the best way to live your life. And after we got married, time went on and I started teaching. You were working at your job, and I hated teaching. And if you remember from past stories, basically the reason I had chosen to be a teacher was because of a blessing my father gave me in high school. And I had gotten a 4-year degree to be a teacher. I had prepared to be a teacher in all these different ways. And as the school year progressed, I absolutely hated it. And I was super unhappy. I would have panic attacks before going into work. The kids, when I was teaching 9th grade, were so incredibly rude to me. And I just realized pretty quickly I was not cut out to be a teacher. And I really had this crisis of faith because I had felt like I had this direction from God during this blessing that I should be a teacher. And I pursued it. I followed God's command. And here I am being a teacher and realizing that this is not what I want to be doing, and it's making me have the worst mental health of my life. About midway through the year, so we'd been married for about a year, I had this moment where I was sitting in the parking lot waiting to go into our apartment and staring out over the mountains and just had this realization, or really just allowed myself to think, maybe God isn't real. Maybe instead of being forced into this job that's so clearly not a fit, and thinking of all these other moments, I received this revelation. I was going to serve my mission in Italy. I went to Denver, Colorado. I received another revelation on my mission. I was going to marry this guy. I didn't marry that guy. I married this guy. And I have remembered all of these moments where I had 100% sure believed something to be true and then had it proven not true. And teaching was just one example of all these times that I felt so sure about something because of my revelation that I had received, and then it just was false. And I realized I would have chosen a different career for myself with my own brain, but instead of doing the self-reflection it took to find the career that was right for me, I just blindly followed this blessing from my dad. And when I sat in the parking lot, I finally allowed myself to think, maybe none of it's true. Maybe God isn't real. Maybe the church isn't God's true religion. And I just had this crisis of everything falling on me like a ton of bricks. And that was the moment that you were in the apartment, and I just was sitting there having this realization, and I had to walk in and decide if I was gonna tell you. I mean, you served a mission, I served a mission, and breaking this news was gonna be really scary to me. What do you remember about that one night?
I remember that first night you expressed it in pretty tentative terms. I think that, initially you said something along the lines of, I'm not sure if the church is true. It was certainly softer than saying, I don't think God exists, for example. And it felt as though you were sort of dipping your toes into that thought a little bit. Part of me that felt a lot of apprehension, because I think that it represents a really big change in the entire structure of our lives if that thought ended up going somewhere. But there was another part of me, a significant part of me, that felt a lot of relief. I think that you were very religiously scrupulous through a lot of our very early marriage and when we were dating. And I think that there was a little bit of a relief for me also in feeling like that might be fading somewhat.
Did you ever consider divorcing me, as people online seem to think?
No, not once in the process of leaving the church did I consider divorcing you.
Why do you think a lot of people, when they have this conversation, end up discussing divorce? Because it seemed, honestly, from personal friends, from stories online, from people I've met, so many people, even comments on videos, people will say, how did your marriage survive? Basically, most people don't get through this type of crazy experience of going from a high demand religion to being both completely irreligious and secular, basically. And I wonder why so many people do go straight to talking about divorce.
Well, I think part of it is that one or both partners might lack the mental flexibility to allow for a mismatch in opinions and feelings about the church, right? I think often it's the case that, maybe one person's moved on and they're looking at their partner who's still stalwart in the faith, and they have little confidence that that partner can ever come around to their point of view. And I think the other aspect is, probably a level of impatience. We were moving in a similar direction at a similar time, ultimately. And I think that a lot of people whose partner doesn't move as fast or in the same direction as them gets impatient waiting for them and sort of can't imagine continuing to live their life as an active member of the church. So I think both of those things have to do with it. I think we were fortunate to be, sort of both open-minded and moving in the same direction at the same time.
I agree with what you said about being on the same general path, because I feel like we kind of were changing who was ahead of leaving and who wasn't, and almost playing chicken with each other to both stay, especially in those early months after I first told you, because I think that we were kind of afraid of what would happen if just one of us left. So I think we were kind of seeing, are we going to do this together? Is just one of us going to do this? And I think that being ultimately kind of on the same track was very, very helpful. I have some friends who their spouses left 2 years apart from each other. So the wife leaves first, and then 2 years later the husband leaves, or vice versa. And those years of being on different pages sound so excruciating, because we were on different pages for 3 or 4 months. From the time that I made my first confession to both of us definitively saying we're not going to church anymore, I think that probably was about 3 months. But, even those 3 months of the indecision between the two of us was really, really hard. And so I think that probably is what helped us ease into this new relationship, was the fact that we kind of came together pretty quickly versus having to have these years of being on completely different pages.
Around the same time you were going through this, I was taking a couple of night classes at BYU, and one of the classes was a class that was required then. I don't know about now, but it was called Foundations of the Restoration. I used to call it Defense Against the Dark Arts, and the purpose of the class was to sort of teach you all of the potentially troubling aspects of church history from a faithful perspective, to sort of inoculate you from being drawn away by church history. The final project for that course was supposed to be like creating a report or a document or something that conveyed a piece of church history. And in my case, what I decided to do was to create a timeline of Joseph Smith's polygamy. And it included his affair with Fanny Alger. It included marriages to young teenagers. It included marriages to mothers and daughters, to sisters, to other men's wives. It sort of laid out in detail on a timeline all of the kind of ugly details of Joseph Smith's polygamy. After producing this timeline and the essay that went with it, taking it to my professor, who is one of the foremost historians of the church, and saying, is this right? Am I getting something wrong here? What am I missing? And he looks it over and spends some time with it, and he says, yeah, no, this is correct. It's pretty disturbing, isn't it? And that's all he had to offer me was, yeah, it's pretty disturbing, isn't it? And I felt like that really broke my faith.
Because you take it to them and you think they're going to say some magic thing that makes it all okay, or bear some crazy testimony, or have some response. And what my experience has been when sharing this information with active members who already know it is not that they say, well, here's a million different reasons why this is okay, or not that they say anything that makes you feel any better. They kind of just shrug and say, it is what it is. I still believe, so you probably should too. And reading through Joseph Smith's polygamy and finding out how disgusting and corrupt and horrible he was, it's very hard to take that to someone who's a BYU professor and have them say, I don't have, just have nothing to say to you about how to excuse it or how to make you feel better about it. They kind of just say, accept it for what it is. And that's the only way that you can move forward with your testimony.
Which I feel for that professor, because I can understand that being your perspective, that this information is disturbing, but also having your entire livelihood tied to continuing to support the church. And I understand that's a really difficult position. But for me, who had no financial ties to the church
Other than tithing,
right? It wasn't such a difficult decision after fully internalizing that information to say, I can't continue to be a part of this church.
Yeah, and I think that as I had always kind of excused gross church history by saying that I had a testimony of the Book of Mormon, I had a testimony of Joseph Smith, and I think when I started to realize that this spiritual feeling I had been using to confirm truth, the feeling in my tummy to know truth about the world, that this way of learning truth was actually completely inaccurate and kind of made up, I really started to question all this stuff that I had put in the back of my mind as unimportant, because up to that point I had been able to say, if Joseph Smith had all these wives, I believe that he was a prophet because I had a spiritual feeling about it. And so I don't need to dig into church history. I don't need to know more about the wives. I just need to know that the Spirit confirmed the fact that Joseph Smith was a prophet. And so none of the rest of it matters to me. And so as soon as the perception of how I could use the Spirit to figure out truth fell away, all this other stuff that Jackson is coming home and sharing is way more disturbing, because I'm reading it truly for the first time, and I no longer have a testimony that Joseph Smith was a prophet, full stop, no questions asked. So we really, I think, started to together dig into the truth claims of the church, the Spirit, and just started being a lot more honest with each other too. I remember having our first frank conversation ever about the endowment ceremony, because I had always said, I love it. I feel closer to God because I do this. And I had never told anyone my true feelings about it, because I was so ashamed that I didn't have a testimony of this very culty ceremony, but I didn't want to reveal that to anyone and show that I was not enough of a believer. So I also remember that when we first had a truly honest and frank conversation about the endowment, and you also shared, it's a little ridiculous and very strange and probably stolen from Masonry. I just remember feeling so safe and secure, and also just relief at feeling like for the first time I could finally come clean about my true feelings and have someone who could hear me and say, yeah, I also feel the same way about garments, about the endowment, washing and anointing, the whole kit and caboodle of the temple.
It is interesting, because I don't think up to that point I had ever told anyone, frankly, how I felt about the endowment ceremony either. It's just
I'm so glad we don't have to do that anymore.
It's just not done. And it definitely had some Midsummer vibes, if you've ever seen that movie.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. And so I think throughout that time, we were kind of just binging all of this anti-Mormon content, or, we were watching Mormon stories, we were listening to Infants on Thrones, reading books, Rough Stone Rolling. We're really just both trying to get our hands on as much stuff as possible. I remember one Sunday, Jackson decided to go to church, because this was obviously still in the phase where we were not totally on the same page, because I think for a while you were feeling like you wanted to go to make it work for the community and for cultural reasons and for the nice message.
And my boss was my elders quorum president.
So I remember one Sunday you said you wanted to go, and I was having, when I would go to church, I was feeling like I wanted to throw up. Once I stopped believing, I had a hard time with church, because it just felt like such a lie, and it seemed I just would feel so claustrophobic every time I would go into a church building, because I didn't believe anymore. And I remember one Sunday you went to church, and I was in the car, and I walked into a Five Guys, because I'm pretty sure that was open on Sunday.
Yeah, I remember around this time coming out of church to Five Guys fries frequently,
Yes,
which I
and
loved.
I had never allowed myself to shop on Sunday. You know, that was that was one rule. I was always a rule follower, so I had never allowed myself to shop on Sunday. And I remember while you were at church, I went into Five Guys and I bought a burger and fries and I took it back to my car and I sat there scrolling the ex-Mormon subreddit while eating my burger and just feeling like the foundation of my life was crumbling underneath me and I had no idea what I was doing and feeling so confused because I was too afraid to move into this not Mormon world, but also too afraid and just not even believing to stay in the Mormon world. So I lived in this limbo, I think, during those months because I just felt like I couldn't move ahead. I didn't want to make the decision to leave for good, but I also knew I didn't believe anymore. So it was just a very weird time.
Throughout my life, there had been a number of times when I had seriously doubted the church. And I remember one of the first times I really took a look at the church and felt like it might not be true is when I was 16. And at the time, what I told myself was, look, for over a century, your family has been Mormon. These are your people. You've been raised among Mormons. You've lived among Mormons this whole time. You are a Mormon.
And you grew up in Utah quite a bit.
Yeah, I grew up
back
spending
and
a
forth.
lot of my time in Utah, and my pioneer ancestors founded some of the little towns in southern Utah, and it felt to me like Mormons were my people. And so I had this thought that like maybe it doesn't matter if it's literally true. These are my people, and I'm going to live among them and serve them and act as if I believe. And I think that train of thought gave way to phases of really believing strongly and phases of believing a little less. But what this meant was that kind of at the time we started doubting, I think I was slower to walk away from the organization because I'd already grappled with and constructed a framework that allowed me to continue attending and living as a Mormon even when my faith was kind of at a low point.
And I think that I only ever wanted to be Mormon because I had a belief in it. And so as soon as I stopped believing, I just felt so disingenuous taking the sacrament, taking part in any part of the religion because I didn't believe it. And I just felt like I never had this nuance of existing in the church for the community. I liked the community, some aspects of it, but I had never been there for it. So I think that was maybe a difference. And so there was maybe 3 weeks where Jackson went to church and I stayed home. And I remember those were really scary weeks. And I felt like, I guess, I think I started to feel like maybe, briefly for 3 weeks, I was feeling like this is, I guess, our new norm. Jackson goes to church on Sunday. I go get my Five Guys and scroll the ex-Mormon subreddit and look at funny memes of Satan. There came a point where I think the third or fourth Sunday, Jackson said he was going to church. And I said, I'm going to go this week. I'm going to see if I can make it work because I was in this limbo stage still. And as we went to church, I had that same feeling, the claustrophobic, gross feeling. And I made it through, the church was still 3 hours, now it's 2, but I made it through the first and second hour. And as the time goes on, my gross feeling is growing. I make it to the third hour of Relief Society, and I remember during Relief Society, this woman, the Relief Society president, the leader, said that everybody was going to share their testimonies of Joseph Smith because the lesson that people were supposed to prepare, the person didn't come to church for whatever reason. So instead of having a lesson, we were going to share our testimonies of Joseph Smith. So she puts the picture of Joseph Smith up on the podium in front of all of us, and I just feel worse than I felt the entire time, because if there's one person I have a bone to pick with at this point, it's Joseph Smith. And maybe I can get behind at that point, the songs to Jesus and all, but I did not feel like I could handle a full hour of bearing testimony about Joseph Smith. And so all these women stand up, they say their little testimonies about how, he was the greatest man, second only to Jesus, who's ever walked the earth, and Praise to the Man. A woman read the lyrics to Praise to the Man, which is a song about how important Joseph Smith was. And, there's eyes that are filling with tears, the best testimonies ever, going around the room. And I recall, a common saying in the church is a testimony is found in the bearing of it. And I remember thinking to myself, maybe if I bear my testimony, I will have that feeling back again, and there will be something that changes, and I will just know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the church is true, and I can finally go back, and everything is going to go back to normal. And so I stand up and launch into my testimony, and I say, I'd like to bear my testimony. I know that at one point I did have a testimony that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I know he did have 30 plus wives. Many of them were children, and many of them were already married when Joseph Smith married them. And I also know that there's a lot of evidence to show the Book of Mormon is completely made up and he didn't translate it out of the gold plates. But I also know that Joseph Smith, I had a testimony of him, and I've shared testimony of him in the past. And so if I believed that he was a prophet in the past, I guess maybe I do still believe he's a prophet now. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. And I sat down. And for a second, the world paused, and I just had this feeling like this hope, like maybe something is going to change, and I'm going to have some revelatory moment. And I look up, and I just see that every woman in the class is staring at me with shock. The Relief Society president gets up, and before everybody else, she had been saying, "Thank you for your testimony, Sister So-and-so. Thank you for your testimony." She pretends like I do not exist. And she launches into her own very impassioned testimony about how Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and he saw God and Jesus Christ in the Sacred Grove. But I remember feeling totally cut off and completely shunned, and everybody acted like I didn't exist. I didn't feel any sort of little warm burning in my bosom. There was no angel that visited me, and I waited for a few more minutes to pass so that I wouldn't be making a scene, and I walked out of the room, I walked to the car, and I sat in the car till Jackson was done with priesthood hour, and that is the last time I ever went to a Mormon Church service, which was now about 8 years ago.
How many seeds of doubt do you think were sown that day?
I've told that story, and whenever I have told that story, the video has had a lot of views, and I've always wondered if someone is going to reach out and say, I was in the Relief Society that day, and I remember. Because that doesn't happen very often. People don't say stuff like that very often. So I do wonder, if you're watching this and you were there, I would love for someone else to share what that was like for them to hear as a believer. But I think that it was not long after that we both fully decided we were going to stop going to church. And some people often, in their comments have said that you stopped going because I ruined your testimony and it was my fault. And somebody the other day said, I think he wanted to divorce you, but he just felt bad for you. So now's your chance to answer that claim.
Well, I don't think the Spirit was speaking to them on that one. No, I think that the timing of our decision was conveniently close to each other, but I think we were on the same path already, and I think in some ways I was paving the way for you to come to this conclusion, and in some ways I think that you were paving the way for my decision. But I think that it was a journey that we took truly together.
Before we continue, just a reminder to like this video and hit subscribe. Smash the subscribe button if you haven't already. Just I have a new video every week. Sometimes Jackson makes a guest appearance. And I just talk about Mormonism, my experience with Mormonism, Mormon doctrine.
Grab me a copy of the book. Can I plug it?
Oh yeah, sure.
And if you're on this crazy journey of leaving the church yourself, pick up How to Leave the Mormon Church by my wife, Alyssa Grenfell.
Thanks. Thank you for pitching my book.
Around the time that you had borne your anti-testimony to the Relief Society, we had also set up a meeting with our bishop. And my hope every time I interacted with someone in authority in the church and shared my doubts with them was that they would confront them head on. And in this meeting with the bishop, I began to share the things that I had been learning about Joseph Smith and that concerned me. And I guess you could say my testimony was found in the bearing of it. As I started going through this, I was getting more and more impassioned talking about all of the problems I saw in church history and all of the ways in which it seemed to me that the church couldn't be true. And all he had to say was, I don't really want to engage with any of that. And I remember that for me, that really was a moment that clinched it. When I realized that there wasn't a single faithful person in my life who was prepared to stand and defend the church on its history or on its truth claims. And in fact, most of them didn't even want to hear about it.
Yeah, and I remember because I was there, I just remember feeling so disappointed that, this is a church and a religion and a belief that you've put on this pedestal for so long, and nobody tells you any of this stuff. Nobody tells you about really Joseph Smith's polygamy. Nobody tells you about reasons why the Book of Mormon might not be the book of scripture that they say it is. These are not things that are really discussed. I mean, you had one class about it. You would tell me things in that class, though, I had never heard. And so most of the history that you dig up as you're leaving the church is stuff that nobody's ever told you. And then when you go and ask them about it, they reveal that they've known about it all along, but it just doesn't matter to them. And that, to me, also is a huge damning aspect of when you have these conversations, is not that they are also, oh, surprised, I've never heard that. They totally know about it most of the time. They completely are like the ostrich putting its head in the sand because they know the history, a lot of them, especially bishops, people who are very heavily invested in the church. They know the history, they choose to ignore it. And they choose to not talk about it with the younger people who are coming up until maybe they bring it to them directly. And so, even when they do kind of give a little hint of putting things on the gospel topics essays, they'll mention it, but they really bury it and hide it and pretend like it doesn't exist or that it's just not important. Joseph Smith's polygamy, just not important. We're going to have a little section about that in the back of the book and talk about it very broadly and act like it was a minor aspect of the way the church evolved in the beginning. After we left, some of my favorite stories are of how we started breaking the Mormon rules together because, you don't usually get to have your first drink with your spouse when you're 24. Most people have their first drink, I don't know, when they sip their parents' wine at a family dinner or something, but all of our firsts outside the church were together, so that was really fun. And I remember when we finally decided after my Relief Society experience and your bishop experience, we fully decided we were going to leave. We drove to Salt Lake and we went to a little coffee shop and didn't know what to order. I think I got a latte. I can't really. I think I got a mocha.
We got mochas.
Yeah, we both
it was
got
like more sugar and cream than coffee.
Yeah, and the chocolate.
And chocolate
helps cut the taste. Apparently, I don't like mochas now, but we both got mochas, and we have the cutest little pictures. And we both sat there and we did our little sip, and it was just so silly. So silly, but felt like the most monumental moment of our marriage. Like,
it's a big step.
We got married, that was important, but trying coffee together for the first time was mind melding somehow.
The symbolic gravity of choosing to have your first coffee, like it's not a big deal, but within a Mormon context, it's a huge deal. And it feels as though it's a step from just not believing anymore to beginning your life as a non-member or an ex-member. And that felt like a really big step to me.
Yeah, I agree. There's kind of the no longer believing phase. And then there's the decision point where you stop wearing garments, you go underwear shopping, you start, you go try your coffee for the first time. And I do remember feeling so just like it was the most crazy moment to be trying that coffee. It was really fun. And I'm really glad we took pictures because those are some of my favorite pictures of us. But not long after coffee, we went full sinner and we tried drinking for the first time. Mm-hmm. I remember the first time, though, getting drunk. You were gone on a work trip.
Also getting drunk.
And I was with my friend who had also recently left the church. And as we were trying drinking, we went to the liquor store. We just got random stuff. We got a bottle of vodka was what we went with first. And we just start taking shots or out of, cups, basically, because I didn't have shot glasses at our house at the time yet. And I remember drinking, and we kind of compare notes, are you feeling anything yet? No. So we drink more. 5 minutes later, do you feel anything yet? No. And we're drinking every few minutes because, keep in mind, we have no understanding how alcohol works. I thought you basically felt it immediately. So we are here, thinking me and my friend, we're just impervious to the effects of alcohol. And I go open up a bottle of white wine, and I'm struggling to figure it out. And I hear my friend say that she can't feel her face. And I realize I'm struggling to even move my hands. And suddenly we just both realize we're completely inebriated. And that actually was kind of a freaky night because my friend, we basically had so much that there was no going back. She ended up tripping at one point and falling and hitting her eye on a table and getting a black eye. I threw up, and it was just this awful experience.
That same night, I was actually on a work retreat, a company retreat at Bear Lake. And as I mentioned, my boss at the time was also my Elders Quorum president. And so you made a decision when you were going to this retreat, you could choose to stay in a drinking cabin or a non-drinking cabin. And I put down that I was going to stay in a non-drinking cabin. But I attended the festivities over at the drinking cabin, and I had no concept of how to pace myself or what an appropriate amount of alcohol was, and so I would drink as many drinks as were put in front of me. And I remember at one point, I was starting to feel it, and I was like, okay, I should stop. I should have a drink of water. So I'm sipping on a water bottle, and I'm talking to two coworkers. And I'm sharing with them that this is my first time really being drunk. And they thought that was hilarious and amazing. And they were very supportive and kind. Then one of them made a joke while I was in the middle of drinking water. And it struck me as so funny. And I was so sort of lacking in control that I laughed and I spit water all over these two coworkers. It was very embarrassing. But I slowed it down, drank some water. I did end up throwing up at about 4 a.m.
We were both throwing up on two different sides of Utah.
It was
so romantic.
It was awful. Since have learned to really control it. And
yeah, I think that's one of the other interesting aspects of leaving together is that we end up having so many conversations about these moments where we just, anytime before we're going to try anything since the very beginning, we discuss it, we talk about it, we share, what are you worried about? And I think as time has gone on, I feel like it's so funny to me that people ask, how did your relationship survive leaving the church? Because I feel like in many ways it brought us way closer together than we were as members of the church, where the church was kind of the third wheel in our relationship, always getting in the way of truly connecting on things. Like, I can't believe we didn't have a frank conversation about the endowment till after we were already married. But I was holding up my guard so much, even to my husband, that I wasn't willing to share the way I really felt about it. And so I think leaving together allowed us to have all of these conversations that we wouldn't have had if we were still active members of the church, and really be really vulnerable with each other in ways that I don't know that we would have experienced if we would have stayed in the church.
And I'll say, in the midst of a hangover the next day, I was pretty convinced that the Lord was right about alcohol.
Yeah, I do remember the next morning I was like, oh, maybe they're right about this one. Thank you guys for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to Jackson for being my guest on the channel today. And I hope we answered some of these questions everybody has. It's so funny. If you Google, is Alyssa Grenfell, one of the results that apparently people are Googling is married. Is Alyssa Grenfell married? Well, the answer is yes. But I'm really grateful and happy and lucky, honestly, that I got to be married to someone that, my relationship survived this crazy transition.
Winner of the Alyssa Games is still on top, baby.
The winner of the Alyssa Games.
Thank you for
still here to this day.
Thank you for not divorcing me because I left the church.
Thank you for not divorcing me because I left the church. The funny thing, too, is that when I removed my name from the church roster, I spiritually divorced you. So we are no longer in an eternal relationship. It's till death do you part, I guess. But that's going to make every moment a little more sweeter, in my opinion.
And don't worry, we'll get one of our cousins to rebaptize you and seal us again after
Yeah,
you die.
my family always says they're going to baptize me after I'm dead anyways. Just a reminder, if you haven't, and if you've made it to the end, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, drop a comment if you have a question for Jackson or I, and as always, I will see you all next week.
See you soon.